There is a lie that society tells men as they approach and cross the threshold of 50. It is a persistent, insidious lie. Broadcast through movies, whispered by well-meaning relatives, and forcefully pushed by a culture that fundamentally misunderstands the architecture of the mature male mind. The lie is that a man over 50 without a woman by his side is inherently tragic. The lie tells you that if you are 50, 55, or 60 and you are not actively navigating the dating market, not desperately swiping on applications, and not trying to secure a new girlfriend or wife, you are somehow giving up on life. You are told that your destiny is to become a lonely, bitter old man, rotting away in an empty house, devoid of purpose and starved of affection. Society looks at a solitary older man and assumes he is broken. They assume he has been defeated. But what they fail to understand, and what we are going to tear apart in this video, is that for a growing brotherhood of men, stepping away from the dating market after 50 is not a defeat. It is the ultimate, undeniable victory. This is the hard truth about dating after 50. It is not the sugar-coated, politically correct advice you will find in mainstream magazines. This is the brutal, unfiltered reality that men speak about when the doors are closed and the societal filters are turned off. If you are a man in this age bracket or approaching it, you already know that something inside you has fundamentally shifted. The games that made sense in your 20s, the compromises you were willing to swallow in your 30s, and the heavy burdens you carried through your 40s, they no longer fit. You have reached an echelon of life where the currencies you value have completely changed. You are no longer trading your time for validation. You are no longer trading your resources for the illusion of companionship. And you are absolutely no longer willing to trade your hard-earned peace for the chaotic, unpredictable theater of modern dating. The first hard truth we must confront is the reality of what modern dating actually demands from a man over 50, and why the return on that investment is practically non-existent. When a man reaches this stage of life, he has typically spent 3 decades functioning as a utility. He has been a provider, a protector, a human shield against the harsh realities of the world for everyone else. He has worked the grueling hours, paid the staggering bills, navigated the divorces, surrendered the assets, and rebuilt himself from the ground up. He has the scars, both visible and invisible, to prove it. Now, society tells him he needs to jump back into the arena. But what does the arena actually look like at this age? It is an arena filled with individuals who are carrying 50 years of unresolved trauma, hardened expectations, and deeply ingrained habits. Dating at this age is no longer 2 young people building a life together from scratch. It is 2 fully formed, rigid lives colliding. And let us be brutally honest about the expectations placed upon the man in this dynamic. The modern dating market for older men is heavily weighted toward financial and emotional rescue. Many men find that they are not being evaluated as a partner, but as a retirement plan. They are being assessed for their capacity to provide the lifestyle, the security, and the comfort that a prospective partner demands, often without offering anything remotely equivalent in return. A man over 50 has spent his entire life building his sanctuary. He has fought, clawed, and scraped to secure his finances, to buy his home, to set up a life that finally runs on his own terms. Why would he voluntarily invite an unknown variable into that sanctuary? Why would he risk his financial survival, his legally protected assets, and his daily tranquility for a relationship that statistically has a high probability of ending in further division of his wealth? The math simply does not work anymore. This brings us to the second hard truth, which is the profound biological and psychological shift that occurs in a man as he ages. In your 20s and 30s, your biology was driving the ship. The imperative to reproduce, to conquer, to secure a mate was a deafening roar in your mind. It pushed you to tolerate massive amounts of disrespect, to perform ridiculous courtship rituals, and to twist yourself into knots to be deemed acceptable. But as a man crosses 50, the roar becomes a whisper. The hormonal drive that once forced you to chase validation is replaced by a deep, resonant desire for peace. This is not a loss of masculinity, as society tries to shame you into believing. It is the evolution of masculinity. You have graduated from the desperate need to be chosen to the absolute power of choosing yourself. You realize that you no longer need a woman's approval to validate your existence. Your worth is no longer tethered to your ability to attract a female partner. When this biological and psychological liberation happens, you look at the dating market with clear, unclouded eyes, and what you see is exhausting. The performative conversations, the forced dates, the careful navigation of another person's emotional triggers, the endless text messaging games, it all seems incredibly juvenile. A man who has survived the brutal realities of life, who has buried friends, who has built and lost fortunes, simply does not have the bandwidth or the desire to sit in a coffee shop and pretend to be fascinated by superficial small talk just to avoid going home alone. Because the truth is, he wants to go home alone. His home is his fortress. It is the one place on earth where he does not have to perform, provide, or protect. It is the place where he can finally just exist. Let us dig deeper into the concept of loneliness, because this is the primary weapon used to shame older men into dating. You don't want to die alone, they say. This is the ultimate fear-mongering tactic. But here is the third hard truth. There is a massive, fundamental difference between being alone and being lonely. Loneliness is a state of lack. It is the painful feeling of missing a connection. But solitude, the deliberate, chosen state of being alone, is a state of profound abundance. Men over 50 who step away from the dating market are not suffering from loneliness. They are mastering solitude. When you strip away the noise of a relationship, when you are no longer organizing your schedule around someone else's moods, preferences, and demands, you are finally introduced to the man you have always been beneath the armor. You discover hobbies that you suppressed decades ago. You wake up on a Saturday morning, and the entire expanse of the weekend belongs to you. You eat what you want, when you want. You spend your money exactly how you see fit, without a single argument or justification. You sleep in total silence, waking up rested and completely in control of your reality. Society calls this tragic. But ask any man who has truly embraced this lifestyle, and he will tell you it is the most intoxicating freedom he has ever experienced. The threat of dying alone loses all its power when you realize that living in peace is vastly superior to living in constant low-grade conflict just to have a warm body in the room. Many men have realized that the most profound loneliness they ever experienced was not when they were single, but when they were lying in the same bed next to the wrong woman, feeling entirely misunderstood and deeply unappreciated. The fourth hard truth revolves around the sheer liability of modern relationships for a man who has accumulated value. We must speak about the legal and financial realities, because they are the invisible chains that ruin men's lives. By the time you are 50, you have a lifetime of labor stored up in your assets. Your home, your pension, your retirement accounts, your investments. These are not just numbers on a screen. They represent your blood, your sweat, the years of your life you gave to the grind. They are your survival mechanism for the decades you have left. Entering into a cohabitating relationship or a marriage at this stage is the equivalent of pushing all your chips to the center of the table and betting your literal survival on a coin toss. The modern legal system is ruthlessly indifferent to a man's sacrifices. It does not care that you worked 80-hour weeks to buy that house. It does not care about the physical toll your career took on your body. In the eyes of family courts, the moment you allow someone to establish residency or claim partnership, your assets become a target. And at 50, 60, or 70, you do not have the time to rebuild. If you lose half your net worth at 30, you can grind it out and recover. If you lose it at 65, you are facing a terrifying, impoverished end of life. Senior men are waking up to this asymmetrical risk. They are looking at the contract of modern relationships, reading the fine print, and realizing that the penalty for failure is total financial annihilation. To refuse to sign that contract is not cowardice. It is the highest form of self-preservation and intelligence. The fifth hard truth is the realization that the cultural narrative of happily ever after was a marketing campaign, and you are no longer the target demographic. For your entire life, you were sold the idea that success for a man means a beautiful wife, a picket fence, and a harmonious family life. But experience is a brutal teacher. As you look back over the landscape of your life, you recognize the staggering amount of energy you spent trying to uphold a fantasy that was fundamentally flawed. You recognize the arguments that went in circles, the goalposts that were constantly moved, the unspoken rule that, as a man, your needs must always be placed secondary to the emotional comfort of your partner. You have done your time. You have played the game exactly as you were instructed to play it, and you have seen behind the curtain. You understand that the reward for being a good man in the modern dating market is often just a heavier burden and a sharper knife in the back. Stepping away from dating after 50 is the ultimate act of reclaiming your narrative. It is the moment you stop living your life based on a script written by a society that views you as disposable. It is the moment you look in the mirror and declare that your life is complete exactly as it is. You do not need a missing puzzle piece. You are the entire picture. And finally, the sixth hard truth, the most powerful realization of all. When you let go of the pursuit of a girlfriend or a wife after 50, you unlock a reserve of masculine energy that is terrifying to the modern world. A man who wants nothing from society, who does not seek female validation, who is completely financially independent, and who is entirely at peace in his own solitude, is a man who cannot be manipulated. He cannot be shamed. He cannot be controlled. He is the most dangerous and liberated creature on the planet. He spends his remaining decades not chasing fleeting romances, but building a legacy, pursuing genuine passions, and mentoring the younger generation of men who are desperately looking for a role model of unshakable strength. He walks through the world with a quiet, dangerous confidence, because he has faced the ultimate fear, the fear of being alone, and he has conquered it. He has looked into the abyss of solitude and found it to be a sanctuary of peace. If you are a man watching this, and you have made the decision to step away from the madness, know that you are not alone. You are part of a silent echelon of men who have chosen peace over performance. Do not let anyone shame you for your choice. Do not let anyone tell you that your life is incomplete. You have fought your battles. You have carried the weight. Now, it is your time to rest, to rebuild, and to enjoy the empire of your own solitude. Hit the like button if you understand exactly what we are talking about today. Drop a comment below and share your experience. Let the younger men know what awaits them on the other side of the struggle. Tell us how long it took you to find your peace and what your life looks like now that you have stopped playing the game. Keep building, keep protecting your peace, and never apologize for choosing yourself.